Thank you to our junior singers, to Miss Beth, and to all our leaders that helped them. And it's just a reminder, though, I talked about this recently in Bible study on Wednesdays. It is important that we seize the opportunity to, among other things, that we're not just teaching children directly stories and truths from the Bible, but that we're also teaching truths from the Bible in song, because the stuff just gets there. I can still remember stuff that I learned in children's choir. It just stays there, and so I'm so grateful for those that are doing that. Andrew's birthday was just a few weeks ago, and actually his birthday was on the day that we had the church picnic, where we were down at the ball field, and folks brought stuff. Caroline made a cake because you could bring a dessert and a side and that type of thing. And so we thought we'll kind of seize this opportunity and make a bigger to-do out of this. And so anyway, she makes this peppermint cake that Andrew really likes, and it was a sizable cake. And we anticipated that likely there was going to be some leftover, and there was. And so this slab of cake comes back home after the picnic, and so some people still ate some of that on that Saturday night. The next day was Sunday. After lunch, some had some of the cake, but there wasn't much left, and some others had some that afternoon. But Caroline wanted to make sure that the remaining piece, the last piece, that Andrew got it, because it was his birthday cake. And so I had heard her say or holler out to Andrew, "Hey, make sure that there's a piece of cake up here for you." And I didn't happen to see him come up to get that piece, and I had to come over to the church for some meetings, and Catherine and Peter, they had to come with me for some stuff. And anyway, I was here for a while. I go back home, and as I come into the kitchen, I notice that piece of cake is still sitting there. I didn't think much of it. It's still sitting there. And so I go on past it into the den, and I sit down. A few minutes later, Andrew comes through the den, and he goes into the kitchen, and he comes back in, and he says something about, "Well, there's no cake in there." I thought, that's kind of strange. I would have sworn that I saw a piece of cake in there. But sometimes your mind will play tricks on you, and you think that you saw it. And I thought, well, maybe that's what happened. I really thought that I did. And I said to Caroline, I said, I really thought that there was a piece of cake there when I came in. When she said, well, ask Peter and Catherine. Catherine, Peter, did y'all see a piece of cake? No, there's no piece of cake in there. Okay. Anyway, so a few hours pass, and it comes back to mind, and I'm kind of puzzled by it, because I just feel sure there was a piece of cake there. Well, when Caroline's mom when we had moved her in with us because of the Alzheimer's, I had gotten some cameras so that if we left the house, you'd kind of know what was going on. And so I thought, there's a camera in the kitchen. Let me see what I see. So this is what I saw. So I said, Catherine, what about that piece of cake? She said, well, it wasn't a piece of cake. It was just kind of the end. It was just kind of the end of the cake, not really a full piece. So in that case, it was like a technicality. And so in that case, so she's going to be running for office at some point, but that'll be her wedding photo. Anyway, but we've had our laughs about that, and it was sweet justice. It really was. And you've had instances in your life where you appreciated when there is some sweet justice like that. Like, for example, you've been on the interstate and somebody just is zooming around you and they're driving like an idiot. They scare you to death. They're cutting people off. And you're just so furious. And you're like, this person is driving like a maniac and they're jeopardizing the safety of others. And you're just thinking, where's a trooper when you need one? And there's no cop to be found. And so you're just ticked. But then you just keep on going. And a few miles later, you happen to see some blinking blue lights. And then you see that they got him. They got him. And you're like, sweet justice, sweet justice. Well, we love when that type of thing happens, when it seems as though there are those that are operating and they're operating out of bounds, and they're doing or they have done something that they shouldn't do, and they're seemingly getting away with it. They're operating with impunity. We love it when it gets exposed. We love it when they get caught. We love it when there's a good ending. We love it when the Cake Bandit is identified. You know, for weeks we have been looking at just a lovely woman in the Old Testament, a lady named Jezebel, in a series called Wicked. And this is a lady that we have seen that has been doing some terrible, nasty, awful things. And in truth, we're not told a ton of details about her. She's not in, quite frankly, that many passages of Scripture. We've looked at virtually all of them. And as horrible as some of the stuff that she has been doing, it seems like she's kind of getting off scot-free. It seems as though she's operating with impunity. It seems as though she's kind of doing what she wants and she's getting away with it. Well, today we're going to see how her story ends. And we're going to see that as the end happens, well, there is some sweet justice. But we've not just been looking at her story. We've been looking at her story through a particular lens. And the particular lens that we've been looking at it is through the lens of influence. And looking at her life as an example of how influence works for good and for bad. And paying attention specifically to how, as a follower of Christ, I can learn lessons from this horrible woman. And we can, from how her story ends, still learn lessons about influence. So let's look at her ending today in 2 Kings chapter 9. 2 Kings chapter 9, we're going to start reading with verse 30. 2 Kings chapter 9, starting with verse 30. There we're told that Jehu comes to Jezreel, and Jezebel heard about it, so she painted her eyes, fixed her hair, and looked down from the window. As Jehu entered the city gate, she said, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master?" He looked up toward the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him, and he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and Jehu rode over her. Then he went in, ate and drank, and said, "Take care of this cursed woman and bury her, since she is a king's daughter." But when they went out to bury her, they didn't find anything but the skull, the feet, and the hands. So they went back and told him, and he said, "This fulfills the words of the Lord that he spoke through the servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the plot of the land at Jezreel, the dogs will eat Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's corpse will be like manure on the surface of the ground in the plot of land at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" Well, there's some sweet justice for this horrible woman, and it is for her a horrible ending. But let's think about what's going on contextually at this point. When last we left Jezebel, you remember she was in Jezreel. Jezreel was a town where they had, she and Ahab, who was the king, they had a secondary royal residence. And you remember Ahab decided that he wanted a plot of land next to the palace for a vegetable garden. But the guy who owned it, this was his family land, his family inheritance, and because of that, he didn't want to give it up. And you recall what happened is that Jezebel decided, I'll take things into my own hands, and she conspires effectively to bring about his murder and then the theft of that property. Fast forward a little bit, Ahab is dead. There are now other kings of Israel. Elijah is no longer the prophet of Israel. That baton has now been passed to his successor, a guy named Elisha. And let's just be honest and say, I wish that God had given him a different name so that we could distinguish a little easier. But anyway, so we've got Elijah and now Elisha. And Elisha is the prophet, and a guy named Jehu is the king of Israel. Elisha has been given a very specific task, and the task is to fulfill what God had spoken through Elijah, which was this, that from Ahab, God was going to punish, and there would be no descendants from Ahab, that he was going to effectively erase his lineage because he was so wicked and because everything around his reign was so horrible and so godless that he was going to wipe them off the face of the earth. And so, tasked with this very specific order, that's what Jehu is doing. And those that have come from Ahab, Jehu has been going around now as Israel's king, and he's been killing them. Well, that type of work gets out. That type of activity is spreading. And Jezebel is still alive. She is the widowed queen, and she's living in this secondary royal palace in Jezreel. Word would have gotten to her, oh, the new king is killing all the descendants of your former husband and you. That tells her, you're probably on that list. And so when she would get word or actually see that he was approaching Jezreel, she would know this is not a good sign. He is not showing up with a fruit basket. And so when this happens, when he actually shows up, we're told in verse 30 that she paints her eyes. You could say she puts makeup on. She fixes her hair. And from a lofty position, from a window in this palace, she looks down and she calls out to Jehu and she says, Do you come in peace, Zimri? You say, well, who's Zimri? What kind of name is that? Is that a little nickname that she had for him? Well, if you were to go back to 1 Kings 16, long story short, Zimri was a military commander who killed the Israelite king. So he was a guy who overthrew the government. He led a coup. So she's not complimenting him. So she says, hey, Jehu, are you here? Oh, Zimri, the killer of your master, are you here in peace? And so he calls out and says, hey, who's on my side? Some servants say, and so he says, push her. They push her out the window, and from this height, her body falls to the ground in such a way, and it's graphic. The text is graphic. Blood splatters onto the walls, even onto the horses. And Jehu, with his horses, literally rides over her dead, lifeless body. And what does he do? He goes inside. Goes inside where? He goes inside what had been her palace, where she had been living, and he has a meal. He eats her food. He goes through her refrigerator. He drinks her Dr. Pepper. He eats her bologna. As her body is sitting out there, and then he's like, well, she was a king's daughter, so I suppose she should get a burial. Go bury the hag. But they go out there, and what has happened is that dogs have already done most of the work. There's not much left of Jezebel. And he says, oh, this this actually fulfills what God said through Elijah. That was at the end of the passage we looked at last week. God kept his word, and that dogs would lap up her blood. And this actually has happened. So you say, holy cow, Michael. That's kind of, well, it is sweet justice. It's kind of a horror movie. I mean, maybe we should have read this the other night for Halloween. As kids come by and trick or treat, well, the dogs will eat. What? What do you do with this? Again, we have not just been looking at Jezebel's story to say, oh, that's kind of interesting. We've been looking at this specifically through the lens of influence. Here we have her ending, and we're posed with this question. What does Jezebel's ending say to us, or what does it teach us about influence? And I believe it teaches us a couple of things. First of all, this. You have the ability to influence, but you do not have the ability to control. You have the ability to influence, but you do not have the ability to control. You hear that and you say, well, that's so simple, that's so elementary, I knew that. But the reality is, while it is a very simple thought, many times we candidly overlook that. Many times, in truth, over time, we tend to forget that. But think back with me over the past few weeks about how Jezebel operated. She marries Ahab, and not only does she influence Ahab with respect to Baal worship, but because of her marriage and because of her influence, Baal worship gets state-sponsored in Israel. Temples to Baal get erected throughout the nation. When Ahab decides, oh, I'd really like to have that piece of property next door to this secondary royal residence, and Naboth says, oh, no, I'm not going to release that to you. I'm going to keep it within my family. He goes all pouty, and Jezebel thinks, well, you're just kind of a weakling. I'll take care of this. And so she has documents drafted. She signs the name. She takes his signet ring, and she's operating with the full authority. She takes all of these things into her hand, and she brings about Naboth's death, gets the property transferred now to the king, and so she just makes stuff happen. I mean, this is a lady who, by virtue of her position, over time, she has been operating with increasingly pronounced influence to the point where it seems as though she has what? Actual control. Look what's going on in this particular passage. Jehu shows up, and what does she do? Well, she fixes her hair, and it says that she paints her eyes. Now, when you read that, the thought is, well, I mean, she had bad head and she wanted to look presentable. And so she wanted to tease her hair and she wanted to look nice and she wanted to get some makeup on. And maybe what she was trying to do was to seduce him. Now, Jezebel is likely somewhere in her 60s at this point. And if you think for a moment that she's actually trying to seduce him, pay attention to the context. If she's trying to seduce him and like, I don't even know where that came from. Anyway, sorry about that. If she was trying to seduce him, pay attention to the context. What does she say? She calls him Zimri, the guy that is a treasonous coup launcher. Now, if she was trying to seduce him, wouldn't she say something like, Jehu, you handsome dog, you. Jehu, you strapping young king. You remind me of a young Ahab. Wouldn't you think there would be some flattery as opposed to insult? But that's exactly what she's doing. She's poking him. In doing some research on the paint that she was using, what was customary at this point was that in this part of the world, at this point in history, that women oftentimes would use a metal known as antimony, oftentimes mixed with lead, which I would not recommend, and oil. And then you would take that and you would paint that around the eyes. And that would darken around the eyes. But in truth, if you watch TV today, look at magazines today, women are using all sorts of makeup today, in particular, to darken around the eyes. Why do you think she would do that? But pay attention also to her physical position. Where is she? She's perched up in this window, and she's darkening her eyes. What do you think she's doing? I believe she is seeking to operate from an imposing position with her big old eyes and calling him this name as if to say, I'm not afraid of you. I will go toe to toe with you. I will stare you down, as if to encourage Jehu to back off, and somehow she might negotiate herself out of this. Somehow that she's going to survive this, and that he's going to back off, and she's going to get off once again scot-free. What she has been doing is that she has been operating with influence in such a way for so long that she believes she can, in every situation, she's got control. She's got control. But what we see is, just as she is putting on this makeup, putting on a mask, at the end of the day, that's what our control is. It's a mask. It's a facade. Because the best that you and I can do is influence. We actually don't have the ability to control. What's the difference? All right, so Caroline and I just celebrated our 20th anniversary, and I love Caroline from the depths of my heart. She loves me from the depths of her heart, and all of those things are true. But we do not, if pressed, probably like riding with each other. Because, if pressed, we probably would say the other one doesn't drive well. Maybe you would say the same thing about your spouse. When I am driving, Caroline seems to operate with the notion that I am Magoo. If you remember him, Magoo was blind and needs to be told about any and everything that is out there. And so she feels compelled to, you see that car there, don't you? You see, and so there's all of this. I mean, I really think she believes that I'm got a white stick out on the bumper. I'm not going to lie. It's frustrating. It's frustrating. Yes, I see it. Anyway, so this little game we play. And so when she drives, I think, for example, she presses the brake entirely too late. What they are called, in my estimation, are panic stops. And that means that I panic as we get ready to stop. And I don't know about your cars. Our cars are fancy. Really fancy. Your car may have, like, fancy navigation and all kinds of stuff on it. Our cars have these things, they're called imaginary brakes. And so, like, if she's driving and she's not pressing the brake at the appropriate time, and honestly, I can't help it. I try not to. And I don't say it's time to press the brake, but I just... Do you do that? And you start stomping the floor as if you're Fred Flintstone, and somehow you're going to slow that minivan down. And she notices that. She doesn't like that either. Now, here's the question. Does it influence her? It does influence her. It may or may not lead her to apply the brake. It may lead her to say, quit. But is it actually going to control the vehicle? It's not. Because that's how influence works. Influence does not equal control. But sometimes we forget that, because over time, especially as we have position for a particular time, our influence, the weight of our influence grows. And the weight of it is such that, and the scale of our position may grow, so that we are barking out orders and people are doing stuff and we are suggesting things, and all of a sudden things just kind of magically happen. And we may not consciously think so, but we get to the point where we think, hey, I'm just moving pieces around the board and stuff just happens. Jezebel thought, even in the face of death, that she was going to control stuff. But what she discovered was that her control, just like mine, just like yours, is nothing more than pretense. We have the ability to influence, but we don't have the ability to control. The last lesson I would say to you is this: the weight of influence and the direction of legacy are not bound. The weight of influence and the direction of legacy are not bound. Here, what does that mean? Over time, the weight of Jezebel's influence has gotten what? Enormous. In truth, if she wants something to happen, she can prod and cajole and can orchestrate and conspire, and she can kind of get stuff to happen. She just can. I mean, she by virtue of her influence, got Baal worship instituted throughout the entire nation. The weight of her influence was so great. I don't know if you remember this, but with Elijah, the prophet of God, on the heels of him staring down the 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Do you remember what happened immediately after that? Jezebel says, I'm going to get you. And what does he do? This great prophet of God runs and says, God, just go ahead and kill me. Let's get it over with. That's how influential this woman is. She believes even in the face of death, she can paint her eyes dark and stare down the king from an imposing position, and somehow this is not going to result in her ending. So she has profound influence, and it has gotten to the point where she thinks that it is control. She has been able to manipulate things. She's been able to control the story. She's been able to control the narrative so much throughout the whole of her life. You would think if someone has that much influence, if the weight of their influence is that great, that even in death, once they're gone, that the story, they're even able to control that. But they're not. You know, pay attention to this. Throughout the whole of Jezebel's life, she's getting away scot-free. Isn't she? It seems like it. She's doing all these terrible, horrible things. Terribly godless, horrible, despicable things. And she's getting away seemingly scot-free. There's only less than half a dozen passages where this woman is mentioned. But we're still talking about her today. Give this some thought. There are not a ton of people for whom the word mononym is appropriate. And by that I mean that they are known by just one name. Right? We've got Elsie, but then you've got Elvis, Beyonce, Madonna, Cher. Back it up earlier, you've got Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. You've got Jezebel. I mean, there's not that many. Now, certainly today there are increasing numbers of individuals that get known just by one name, but by and large, these are modern artists that have produced and have generated art or music that has been listened to literally billions and billions of times. Albums that have been purchased in the hundreds of millions, even billions of copies. Plato and Aristotle, they were philosophers that were writing, and their ideas were not only verbally transmitted, but were written down and have been passed on for more than 2 millennia. Jezebel, though, she didn't write anything down. Jezebel didn't write any songs. She didn't star in any movies. But it's interesting that Jezebel is a name that people, not just those that are sitting in the pews of churches today, but those who have no connection with faith whatsoever, no connection with the Bible whatsoever, they're aware of that name. And they know that it is inextricably linked to evil, that it is synonymous with evil. In fact, if you want to call someone, particularly a woman, a horrible, ruthless woman, you would call her a Jezebel. And that's her legacy. Now, in life, she had this profound influence, and she seemed to control the narrative, and it seems like she was getting away scot-free. And if she wanted it to happen, it seemed like it would happen. She had this enormous weight of influence. And you would think if you have that enormous weight of influence that you could control how the narrative of your legacy is told. But what's her legacy? It's headed in the opposite direction. It tells us this: the weight of influence and the direction of your legacy are not inextricably bound. You can have profound influence in life that is either positive or negative, and the legacy can head in the opposite direction. Let me give an example. Many of you may be familiar not only with this name, but also with this story. But a guy that had a notable impact on me was Ravi Zacharias. And those of you that know him or read him or heard him or saw him would understand why that was somebody that you might want to pay attention to as a follower of Christ. He was a significant apologist, defender of the Christian faith. And God blessed this man with a profoundly gifted mind and an ability to communicate and to take very complicated thoughts and philosophies and take biblical truth and engage those that were skeptics and even antagonists of the faith and cause them to realize that what God has called us to is a reasonable, sound proposition. And whether it was at Oxford or whether it was at Harvard, he would engage some of the most erudite and most learned among us and would do so with just profound oratorical skill and deftness. And it was just amazing to watch him work. And you could watch his videos. You could watch him on panels where he would just off the cuff answer with such concise accuracy. His books, so good. He founded an organization that was committed to the same task, that employed stacks of other apologists that were, particularly on campuses across the world, that were engaging people and promoting a reasonable faith. And we ought to be so grateful for this. But long story short, he was diagnosed with spinal cancer and died I think less than 9 months after diagnosis. And it seemed to be so very tragic. But what was far more tragic than his death was what came to the fore after his death, which was apparently that he was living a double life. And that for decades, he was engaged in all manner of sexual impropriety, traveling around the world, oftentimes going particularly to Thailand to engage in all sorts of godless sexuality, owning massage parlors that he took advantage repeatedly of his employees and staff. the ministry that he founded that had an annual budget of $19 million gets shuttered. All of those employees laid off and closed. Books get pulled, videos get pulled. If you want to, if you don't believe me, Google Ravi Zacharias' name now. And it stinks. This guy who had such profound and positive influence. Such influence that we would celebrate in this direction. Now his legacy is that direction. So what I'm telling you is this. The weight of your influence in life by virtue of your position, by virtue of the mask that you wear, by virtue of the giftedness that you have, by virtue of the things that you say, it may be pointing in this direction. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the choices that you make, what you actually do, that's going to determine your legacy. And that influence and that legacy, they are not inextricably bound. What you and I, as followers of Christ, should aspire to, what we should want, is that what I say, what I preach, what I believe, what I choose, and what I do, there is alignment, so that my influence and that my legacy are headed in the same direction. So I'll leave you just with this simple question. What is your influence, and is your legacy hitched to it? Will you bow your heads with me?